There is a moment in The Wizard of Oz when the fire dies down, the smoke clears, and the great and powerful Oz turns out to be just a nervous man behind the curtain.
Oh, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
2025 felt like that moment. We watched a sitting defense secretary try to rebrand his department as the Department of War, reciting the Lord's Prayer over military imagery like it was a war cry. We watched the state of Louisiana use the blunt force of the law to plaster the Ten Commandments onto public school classrooms. And we watched politicians who spent years shouting about free speech suddenly float the idea of labeling political dissent as terrorism. It would be easy to look at the fire and the smoke and say theocracy is rising, but I've looked at the data and I've looked at the demographics, and when the curtain gets pulled back, you don't find a powerful wizard. You find a movement terrified of its own irrelevance. 2025 wasn't the year they took over. It was a year that we saw the man behind the curtain. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Mike Smithgall, the unelected mayor of Atheistville, and this is today's Mic Drop. Now, we know politicians lie, but demographics don't. In one episode, I discussed the massive 17-point drop over a 10-year period in the number of Americans who say religion is important to their daily lives. Now, a drop that big, that fast, doesn't happen by accident. It happens because millions of people are quietly looking at what's being offered in the pews and deciding they just don't want any part of it. But the real story isn't just that the people are leaving, it's how they are leaving. We analyzed the zombie church phenomenon in a recent episode, and new research from 2025 shows that religion dies in a very specific sequence. Starts out with participation, and then importance, and finally belonging. First, people stop showing up. Then they stop caring. And finally, usually years later, they drop the label altogether. Right now, we are seeing the panic in the religious right because they can see the participation numbers consistently falling. They know the pews are empty, and they know the youth groups are shrinking. And this context changes how we view their political aggression. When you have the people, you don't need to force your religion onto classroom walls. You don't need to pass laws like Louisiana's HB 71 to mandate scripture in schools. You only do that when you realize you've lost the culture, you've lost the argument, and your only tool you have left is the blunt force of the state. The aggressive Christian nationalism we saw this year wasn't a flex, it was a flinch. The most glaring example happened down in Florida, my home state. We watched the exact same political movement that enforces strict abortion bans, claiming sanctity of life and state authority over bodies, suddenly discover the absolute sanctity of bodily autonomy when it comes to vaccines in schools. We heard the Surgeon General of Florida invoke the God's will to say the state couldn't possibly mandate a measles vaccine mere months after the state mandated that women must carry pregnancies to term, regardless of their own will. And as we discussed in that episode, they ended up in this very awkward position where they're defending the freedom for viruses while denying freedom for women. It revealed that bodily autonomy isn't a principle to them, it's a prop. It's a phrase they pick up when it's useful, and they drop it the moment it gets in the way of their theology. We saw the same thing with free speech. When Pam Bondi told a Katie Miller podcast audience that the Justice Department would target hate speech and then threaten to label domestic political movements like Antifa, which stands for anti-fascist, as terrorists, the mask came all the way off. The same people who spent years crying about censorship on Twitter were suddenly eager to use the Department of Justice to silence their critics, which, ironically, is exactly what fascists do. They prove they don't actually care about the First Amendment, they only care about their own microphone. Then there was the spectacle of Pete Hegseth. We watched a cabinet secretary try to rebrand the Department of Defense as the Department of War. He released a video reciting the Lord's Prayer over military imagery, complete with jets and soldiers and guns, and finally ending with a Department of War logo. It was the perfect snapshot of Christian nationalism. Just like the Wizard of Oz using flames and smoke to terrify Dorothy, they're using the military, jets, and the war logo to try to terrify us. They are turning up the volume because they know they have lost the audience. But when you conflate politics with divine authority, reality has a nasty habit of biting you in the ass. We saw this with the rapture that was supposed to happen. You remember that? Social media was full of warnings. The hashtags were trending. The date was set for September 24th. And then Tuesday happened. And then Wednesday happened. And just like every single doomsday prediction for the last 2,000 years, the sun came up and the world kept turning. These moments matter. They matter because they break the spell. Every time they predict an apocalypse that doesn't happen or claim a divine mandate for a political policy that fails, they lose credibility. They lose the one thing that religion claims to own, which is moral authority. When you wrap your politics in the cross and then your politics turn out to be cynical, hateful, or just plain wrong, you don't elevate your politics, you drag your God down into the mud with you. All right, quick pause. If you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? I would love to have you join the community here at Atheistville, even if we disagree. Subscribing is absolutely free, and it helps more people find these discussions. I'd also like you to leave a comment. I read every single one of them. And again, whether we disagree or not, I will answer you because I do value some open dialogue. And tell someone else about the show if you think they would like it. Or use something in one of these episodes to create some discussion and create some dialogue back and forth. That really helps, and it creates situations where we can get back to having conversations and not just shouting matches. All right, let's get back to it. Despite all the noise, 2025 was also the year I got to talk about what we actually believe instead of just what we're against. I spent a lot of time this year talking about the oldest lie that believers tell about us, that without God, everything is permissible, that morality is impossible without divine punishment hanging over our heads. In the morality episode, I walked through the evidence from biology, anthropology, and history that proves we don't need a 2,000-year-old book to tell us that hurting people is wrong. Morality isn't handed down from on high. It's an evolutionary trait. It's rooted in empathy, cooperation, and the survival advantage of working together. We're moral because we're human, not because we're afraid of hell. I also talked about the God of the gaps, that shrinking space where religion used to have all the answers. Thunder used to be God. Now it's meteorology. Diseases used to be demons. Now they're viruses. Every time science advances, that space that religion tries to dominate gets smaller. It never expands. It only shrinks. And here's what that means. The secular worldview of evidence and reason and human responsibility, it's the only one that actually delivers results. While they were offering thoughts and prayers and performative bans, we were looking for solutions that work in the real world. My goal isn't to wipe religion off the map. Now, I wouldn't lose any sleep if superstition disappeared tomorrow, but I value my freedom of conscience too much to deny you yours. If I want the right to believe, I have to defend your right to believe. What I'm asking for, what I'm fighting for, is simply a level playing field. I want a government that is neutral. I want a classroom that is honest, and I want a public square where the best idea wins, not the one with the biggest cross. Because here's the truth we learned this year. When faith has to be pushed on people by the state, when it requires laws to force it into schools and threats to silence its critics, it stops looking like morality. It starts looking a lot less like salvation and a lot more like authoritarianism. Okay, that's my 2 cents, unblessed, unfiltered, as always, agree or disagree, but that's what I got for you today. So this episode comes down to one main idea. The noise that we heard from the religious right and the Christian nationalism in 2025 wasn't the sound of the movement on the rise. It was the sound of a movement terrified of its own decline. What matters here is perspective. Don't mistake volume for victory. As we discussed in the zombie church episode, the long middle we are living through is uncomfortable, but the curtain has already been pulled back. We know what's back there, and it's a lot smaller than it looks like on TV. All right, I'm Mike Smithgall. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you on the next one.